Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second edition of the CC Orchestra Show. I hope that you are all doing well and have been having a nice time with your families at home. I am really excited today because we get to talk about another fantastic composer. And of course, it's another one of my favorites. CC always picks the best composers for us to study. So this week, we are going to learn about Johannes Brahms. Say it one more time, Johannes Brahms. And we just spent some time listening to one of the movements from his double concerto, which is a concerto that he wrote for orchestra and violin and cello. You should check it out this week. And I love Brahms because his music is just luscious. It's rich. It's like springtime arriving with greenery and flowers, and it is just so beautiful. And so I'm excited that you're going to have a chance to spend some time with Brahms this week. I hope that you will do a lot of listening of Brahms, and I'm going to give you some ideas later on in our discussion. Now, before we get too far into his music, I want to talk a little bit about Brahms himself. I have a picture. This is a bit of a funny picture, but I do think that it can give you an idea of what he may have looked like. Now, that's not a photograph, it's a drawing, but I think it captures the essence of what Brahms looked like. He was born in 1833 in Germany. Now, if you remember, Beethoven, who we talked about last week, was also born in Germany. And Brahms died in 1897, and he died in Vienna, Austria. So he and Beethoven already have some things in common. They were part of a group in classical music that we refer to as the three Bs: Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. We talked about Bach in another CC cycle, but these are probably the three most famous composers of all time. So Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. And it's pretty cool that Brahms and Beethoven kind of had similar lives, starting out in Germany, and Brahms ended up spending the second half of his life composing in Vienna, Austria. Brahms was pretty unique. Not many composers actually made a living composing. And believe it or not, it's pretty hard to make a living composing today. Most composers had to work several other jobs, and they composed whenever they could, often at night, often all night. But Brahms, after a little while, became really popular, and the public supported him enough that he only had to compose. So that is one really cool fact about him. Brahms wrote during the Romantic period. Now, last week we talked a little bit about some of the differences between the classical period, which was known for its form, in particular a form called sonata form. We talked about that last week. The Romantic period ushered in this new era where in music, the most important thing in music was how it made you feel. So all of a sudden, instead of kind of following a list of rules that made music sound refined and elegant, the composers had a lot more liberty and license to do things in their music that evoked feeling and showed expressiveness and told stories. During the Romantic period, there are quite a few pieces that were written with a specific story in mind or a specific setting in mind. Beethoven wrote something called the Pastoral Symphony, and it was describing a pasture. So as we started to come into the Romantic period, which we talked about last week, that Beethoven really was the bridge. And by the time he was writing his late symphonies, he was writing romantically. Now, Brahms is just totally romantic. Some of the most beautiful melodies of all time are written by Johannes Brahms. And I'm going to play some of those on my violin for you in a little bit. But first I want to talk a little bit more about Brahms and what he was like as a child. So when he was just 6 years old, some of you are probably 6 years old, Brahms invented his own way of writing down music. So he really did compose all of his life. That was before he learned notation, but he just had a drive to write music. And it's pretty cool that sometimes God can show us talents and gifts that we have at such a young age. So he was only 6 when he first started to composing. And like many of you, he loved to read books, he loved to read poetry, novels, and he also really loved folk tales. And perhaps all of that reading showed up in his music down the road. I'm guessing it did. His music was just so beautiful. Now, I'm going to have you listen to another episode of Classics for Kids before we go on too much further. So the episode that I want you to listen to, I wrote this down for you parents. So go to classicsforkids.com, and the show is called About Brahms. And I can't tell if this is showing up backwards for you. If so, I'm really sorry. My phone is recording me as a mirror. So go to classicsforkids.com and look up the show that is called About Johannes Brahms and listen to it. I think it's 5 or 6 minutes, but it will give you a much bigger introduction to his life, and it will give you a bunch of snippets, a little listening segments of a lot of the things that he wrote. And when you're done, please tune back in. Thank you.